Ed Stetzer, who's a well-known speaker and author, leader, influencer in Baptist and evangelical circles, has written an article that has come to my attention. And this article is actually something Jason Whitaker and I plan to discuss. So Jason was one of the people who brought this to my attention. I did see another friend of mine post this on Facebook as well. And so I have a feeling this article is going to get quite a bit of attention and a lot of reaction too. And so, as I said, this is Ed Stetzer writing, and his article here was actually put in USA Today as an opinion piece. And the title is Evangelicals Face a Reckoning, Donald Trump and the Future of Our Faith. I want to read the article here and then make maybe a general comment about this article. I don't want to get too much into my thoughts on it because I do plan to talk about this more with Jason Whitaker later this week. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this article. I know some people are going to be triggered by this, and I understand that. Some people are going to react very negatively to what he's saying here. Other people are going to really be in favor of what he's saying here. But I think it's always good to listen to criticism, and I think it'll be great for us to talk about this, like I said, in the comments, but also Jason and I later in the week. So stay tuned for that conversation, but here is what Ed Stetzer has to say. No one likes to admit they were fooled. It's tough to admit we were wrong. Now many evangelicals are seeing President Donald Trump for who he is, but more need to see what he has done to us. It's time for an evangelical reckoning. I'm an evangelical, like about a quarter of the United States population. Evangelicals believe in the good news of the gospel, that Jesus died on the cross for our sins and in our place, and we need to tell the world about that. But that's not what most people are talking about today. You see, white evangelicals embraced the president, some begrudgingly and some enthusiastically, because he addressed many of their concerns. Many evangelicals and leaders invested money, time, and conviction toward the promise of making America great again. In turn, Donald Trump made good on these investments from an evangelical perspective. Most evangelicals, me included, are grateful for the Supreme Court justices he appointed and for some of the religious liberty concerns he addressed. His anti-abortion stances surprised many, again, me included, and for that I was thankful. Nevertheless, most of that is in jeopardy now because Trump is who many of us warned other evangelicals that he was. We reap what Trump has sown. He has burned down the Republican Party, emboldened white supremacists, mainstreamed conspiracy theorists, and more. Yet of greater concern for me is the trail of destruction he has left within the evangelical movement. Tempted by power and trapped within a culture war theology, too many evangelicals tied their fate to a man who embodied neither their faith nor their vision of political character. As a result, we are finally witnessing an evangelical reckoning. For years, we've been talking about a coming evangelical reckoning. A flood of books, articles, and conferences, many of which I wrote and participated in, have warned of the approaching storm clouds for the evangelical movement. The reckoning is here. Americans in the world have the right to ask us some hard questions. Some of us were vocal, often and early, about the dangers of Trumpism. It was costly. As we sort through the coming months and years, we must be clear on 3 reasons why we have arrived at this point. First, far too many tolerated egregious behavior. The past half-decade has offered near daily examples of people co-opting the gospel for sinful ends. Racism, nationalism, sexism, and a host of other sins have found purchase within the evangelical movement in both overt and subtle expressions. Many have been able to dismiss these examples as outliers that did not truly represent the evangelical movement. We have long since exhausted this excuse. As evangelicals, we have to stop saying this isn't who we are. This is who we are. These are our besetting sins. However, this isn't who we have to be. Second, far too many failed to live up to their promise of speaking truth to power. During the 2016 election, and at many points since, many evangelicals justified their full-throated support by promising to be a check on Trump's character. What has become apparent is that this promise was hollow. Too few were willing to speak out regularly and often couched their criticism so much it lacked any weight. When evangelicals finally had access to the White House, they seemed unable or unwilling to use their prophetic voice to speak truth to power. Watergate figure and later evangelical leader Chuck Colson once said, "When I served under President Nixon, one of my jobs was to work with special interest groups, including religious leaders. We would invite them to the White House, wine and dine them, take them on cruises aboard the presidential yacht. Ironically, few were more easily impressed than religious leaders. The very people who should have been immune to the worldly pomp seemed most vulnerable." That was us. Finally, all of us have failed to foster healthy political discipleship. The foundation of our reckoning was laid far before Trump. Committed to reaching the world, the evangelical movement has emphasized the evangelistic and pietistic elements of the mission. However, it has failed to connect this mission to justice and politics. The result of this discipleship failure has led us to a place where not only our people, but also many of our leaders were easily fooled and co-opted by a movement that ended with the storming of the U.S. Capitol. What comes next? At the root of these three causes lies our inability to live up to our calling as evangelicals, to righteously, prophetically, and compassionately proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world. Our reckoning is not because we have lost worldly power, but because of what we betrayed to attain and sustain it in the first place. I have been working on a book on evangelicalism for 3 years, and it has been one of the most frustrating projects in my life. At its core, the problem is not in diagnosing the illness, but in prescribing the cure. Where do we go? What do we do? How can the evangelical movement navigate this reckoning? In listening and praying, I've found myself coming back to Martin Luther's words. Toward those who have been misled, we are to show ourselves parentally affectionate, so that they may perceive that we seek not their destruction, but their salvation. I don't believe that everyone who voted for Trump was fooled or foolish, and Trump voters are not Trump. They are not responsible for all his actions over the past 4 years, but they are responsible for the ways they responded and for their own hearts. If the evangelical movement is to flourish in the coming generations, we must face and even embrace this reckoning. As leaders and members, we must acknowledge our failings, but also understand the habits and idols that drew us to Trump in the first place. That we have failed and been fooled is disheartening, but not surprising. The true test will be how we respond when our idols are revealed. Will we look inside and repent when needed, or will we double down? Every political and cultural instinct will pull us to the latter, but God calls us to the former. Into this temptation we hear the words of Jesus, "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?" Matthew 16:26. We have reached a reckoning. What comes next will reveal where our trust truly lies. Ed Stetzer, who wrote this, is a dean and professor at Wheaton College, where he also leads the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. So as I said, I knew that reading this article would be triggering to some people, but I think it was definitely worth bringing up this article and listening to what he's saying here so that we could have good discussion about this. I encourage you to leave comments below, but please try to keep your comments constructive and helpful to conversation and edification. There are a lot of things, of course, that I could say in response to this article, but what I generally want to point out here is that I think it's very fascinating that he has been looking at writing about evangelicalism, because Pastor John MacArthur, who I've been talking about a lot in my videos pretty recently is planning to have a conference, a Shepherd's Conference, talking about what is true evangelicalism and really defining that. So it's interesting that this is being thought about and talked about a lot right now, because evangelicalism is often having to take a look at its identity in a culture like ours and see how is it going to define itself and position itself in relationship to the culture. But one thing I do want to point out particularly in response to Ed Stetzer here is that when he talks about evangelicalism in relation to Trump, I think one thing that comes to my mind, it's really important to keep in mind, is that there were actually non-Christians, and I know of some that were non-Christians that voted for Trump, not because they thought he was perfect or even because they were Christians. There were many people voting for Trump because of what they were concerned about on the other side of politics. And what I think a lot of people saw and still see is a growing power monopoly on the other side of politics. And I understand we have a debate in this country about where should our country be headed, but there is what some people see and perceive as a growing power monopoly, particularly more on the left side of the political spectrum. And so examples of this would be with what you see with the tech companies, and actually right now they are cracking down on people more of a certain political persuasion. Now we realize they have their reasons for that, but the point I'm making is that there is a growing power that they exhibit in our culture and that they hold, particularly in various forms of communication, in media, as well as social media. And so this is very concerning to people, whether they're Christian or not. And I think one thing that might be being missed, although I understand a lot of what Ed Stetzer is saying in relationship to evangelicalism, but what he might be not taking seriously enough or really not showing enough in an article like this is not so much why people support Trump, but why they are so concerned about the other side of things and why Trump was so important in their minds in combating the other side of things. Because, again, so many people see there is a growing power on the left. Now, this does beg the question of how much should Christians be in politics? In what ways should they be in politics? How should they look at political leaders? And we will save that to some more discussion later this week as I talk with Jason Whitaker. But those are just some general thoughts that I wanted to share, as well as just put this information out there for you to see and read and also hear your responses to. But thank you so much for listening to some of my thoughts from A Frisch Perspective.